I want to thank you all again for coming tonight. It's really quite a pleasure to discuss these things with you. I think one thing that's special about tonight is that all three of us have been looking at these questions about what AI is, what it can be, what its impact might be, what its strengths are, what its weaknesses are. Mark and I've got recordings of Mark and me arguing about these things back in the 80s, sorry to say. And Ollie has also been, he did a doctoral thesis on this in the 90s on machine learning. So I have to let you know that this isn't the first time that we've had these discussions on this topic, the three of us. So let me kick things off by talking about, it's beyond the algorithm is the title. There are many algorithms, right? But one algorithm that looms large is the transformer, in particular, the algorithm that's used to create these algorithms, actually, used to create these large language models that power ChatGPT and Claude and Gemini and all the other large language model chatbots that you've dealt with. And so I wanted to say something about that algorithm and what's really been going on since about, before ChatGPT even, since about 2020, 2021, at least from my perspective. So I saw this happening. I was launching a startup in Silicon Valley, an AI startup, and so these chatbots, well, not the chatbots, but the algorithms, the large language models, were just becoming widely available to the people in Silicon Valley. And so I saw what happened, and I was there and actually participating in this firsthand, and I think I have a different perspective than a lot of people on this because of that. And I wanted to give you some of that insight about how these algorithms came to be and what they're actually doing under the hood. So the initial idea, as many of you probably know, is that people who were interested in language and using computers to model language found out that if you give certain algorithms lots and lots of data, these algorithms could build up a model of what words are likely to follow, say in English, given the words that happened before. And so in a way, you had a very sophisticated predictive text algorithm. You remember we had predictive text on our phones 10 years ago or whatever, and we have a better version now. But these models were very sophisticated in looking at the ways people use language and using that to build up a very good prediction of what would come next. And then the twist was, well, why don't we take what we predict to be the most likely thing to happen next and actually don't make it a prediction, but actually make it the case. So we'll actually generate text according to what's the most likely. What text would be most likely to happen next, given the way people talk? Well, now we'll actually generate that. And so people were using these generative models to generate text. And then people realized, well, if you constrain... For instance, if you input some context into this, as you know, you put in a question, maybe even just put half a question, the predictive model would then say, well, given the first part of this question, the second half of this question is likely to be as follows. So if the first part of the question was, what's the capital of, then it might be completed with France or whatever was the most likely given the data that it had been trained on. The point was that if you had just, without any constraint, if you just said what follows next, the generative models at that time, early in, say, 2021, would have just said, you type in what's the capital of, and it would say France, and then it would also say Paris, and then it would also say what's the capital of the United States, and it would also say Washington, D.C., and then it would just continue to complete the text that it would think would follow from that initial segment you gave. There was no notion of a conversation, no notion of you being one party in a conversation and the model being another party of the conversation. There was no turn taking. It was just predicting the text it would expect to follow from that. But then people realized, oh, we can create a little puppet show here. We can actually constrain, we can artificially tell the model to stop outputting any more text once it reaches the end of what we might consider to be a turn. And so through these extra constraints and a little bit of training on the output, the illusion that there was a conversational partner there was created. But underlying that illusion was just the model that was trying to predict what the next text would be, independently of who might type that text, who might say that text. So there was no notion of an agent there who has a perspective, who has goals and purposes and knowledge that is trying to participate in a conversation. Nevertheless, that's what we have now. We have these things that look like they're conversational partners when really all they're doing is predicting what text would come next in a conversation and then stopping artificially in order to preserve that illusion. So I find that helpful to keep in mind when I'm thinking about how to interact with these models and how to understand where they can be trusted and where they cannot be trusted, and what they would be good for and what they're not good for, etc. So one thing I've been thinking about, maybe we can talk about this later in the discussion, but I'll just drop, just plant a little seed of thought right now, is that maybe this particular way of interacting with these large language models that is just taken off, which is this conversational partner model, maybe that's just one possible way that we could use these very powerful tools. They're incredibly powerful. These large language models are incredibly powerful, but maybe the paradigm of pretend conversational partner, pretend friend, pretend psychotherapist, whatever it is, maybe we should be looking elsewhere and instead interact with these large language models and get the information that they have out of them, but in a way that isn't so deceptive, that doesn't make us think that there is a person there or a subject there that we're interacting with that cares about us or has any opinions or has any history or experience. Instead, maybe we could use these models to complete our own thoughts or understand them as extensions of our own thinking, or just as repositories of lots and lots of linguistic information that we want to mine, but not through the illusion of interacting with a subject. One last thing I'll say before handing it on to Ollie is that what's interesting about these algorithms, and one way that we might be able to get beyond them, is by keeping in mind that these models are predicting the most likely word to come next, right? So in a way, there's a tyranny of the normal. There's a tyranny of the statistically most likely happening whenever you interact with these. That is, the output is whatever is supposed to be, given the data that it's been trained on, the most expected result. But sometimes it would be nice to leverage all this information and instead maybe try to use it to help me find out what would be an unlikely result to say in this context or to write in this context, or what idea would be novel and not the most normal thing to say or think of in this context. So it would be nice if we could use the technology in a more disruptive way, that instead of adopting what has come before and using that as the basis for what must come next, instead, how can these models help us to think of what is, given what is the most likely thing, what would be an interesting novel thing to produce now and to think now and to write now and to consider now. So with those ideas about the algorithm and possibly moving beyond the algorithm, I now hand you over to Ollie.
Hi there. As Ron said earlier, I've known Ron for nearly 30 years, Mark much more recently, but it was 30 years ago when I moved to Brighton and was studying my PhD in AI. At that stage, I was very much just fascinated by these questions of what can we build with AI, what can happen, understanding intelligence and all those sorts of things as a sort of, almost like just a scientist obsessed with those ideas. And so I just want to give a brief hint of, a transition in my thinking that has sort of gone from being what some people might call a sort of techno-determinist, which is where you believe if you just build the right thing, it'll transform society, and that's what we should focus on. So it gives me the excuse just to focus on the tech that I'm interested in, and I'll just focus on that and build that. But then in 2016, when Brexit happened and Trump happened, I found that devastated me quite significantly, and sort of, obviously this is simplification because, it's more complex than just a one event. The trajectory was to realizing that actually culture and politics and economics are having these massive impacts on what the technology actually gets used for, and how societies get shaped going forwards. And so just burying your head in the tech is not actually going to necessarily get to the sort of outcomes for society that kind of would want to be happening. And so that's sort of how I sort of transitioned towards thinking about politics and economics, and again, lots of simplifications, but I mean, eventually that's why I ended up doing this YouTube channel where I'm talking about a lot of the issues that we're talking about tonight are the kinds of things that I put there, because I feel as if there's a lot of obsession with the technology itself, and some gaps in the way that people are thinking about how this might impact our society. So I think it's these gaps need to be unpicked carefully. And the particular one that I'm focused on at the moment is the gap between, because of course there's just a ton of talk about AI. So in one sense you might be thinking, what do you mean we're not talking about AI? But the particular gap that I'm worried about at the moment is being underexplored, is the gap between where we are now and the political narratives that we have now and where we expect to get to. So typically, there's a very dominant narrative in Silicon Valley and places like that, it's the venture capitalists who've built this wonderful stuff. And if any country wants to sort of, be with the times, they've got to invest heavily in this. They've got to cut regulation, cut tax. Just at the moment, we can't be so generous with the welfare. I mean, look at our deficits. We've got to get that under control. And the only way we can do that is have growth. And the only way we can do that is to invest in this AI. And then, we're going to get to a world where we have UBI and we have abundance for all. And I just think there's a huge gap in that ... that is not being talked about nearly enough. Because actually, as far as I can tell, to get to a place where we actually would have, I mean, UBI might not be the answer, but to have a world where the sort of productivity gains from all of this wonderful technology are fairly distributed, it's not clear to me at all that the right way to get there is to carry on with the neoclassical, neoliberal politics and economics that have given us the last 50 years of growing inequality, huge wealth and power accumulation. And so I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And obviously you're going to keep it brief here, so I'm not going to go into the details of it, but I just wanted to highlight it as a particular issue of concern, that we have people talking about what the future might be like, how UBI might work. But I don't think we've got enough of a conversation about how we need to be changing our politics now. I mean, when you hear some people, they say it's going to be here in 5 years, or it's going to be here in 10 years. And politics is slow. I mean, the discussion about how we should be changing our monetary system and our tax system and our welfare system to support a society that would end up potentially where many of the jobs that people currently earn their wage from will be automated. That conversation is not what we see in elections today. And I think one of the things just to note is that the oligarchs are sort of saying to us, give us all the power and all the money now, and we promise, ... we'll share it with you later, right? And yet, throughout history, the reason that workers have been able to hold the wealthy capitalists to account is a lot to do with the fact that they've been able to withhold their labor, right? So if you end up in the ... and everything's automated, we just don't have that political power to pull back and say at that point, right, now can we share it because, otherwise we'll stop working for you. And, they'll laugh at us. So I think it's also true that probably most of us here, maybe not everyone, but most of us here tonight are going to be on the wrong side of that power equation. I mean, it might not be 5 years, it might be 20 years. But there's an interesting transition that is very hard to manage, very hard to see how we go from here to there. And I just don't think that that's really being talked about enough in terms of the transition and what we need to do now in our politics today to set us up to be able to gradually, because that's going to be the calmest, most effective, and most beneficial to more people, calmly to go through that transition. So that was the piece that I thought I'd drop into the conversation today.
Thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for your interest in this topic. Talking about the power of AI to shape the future as it relates to economy, society, culture. And I want to start with that idea of power. What power does AI have to do those things? And how do we think about that? How do we understand that? What power do I have? What power do you have? And if AI doesn't have the power and you don't have it and I don't have it, then who does have it? And this is a little bit what I think Ali's talking about. And so that's super interesting to me. And I just want to reflect to you a little bit of the conversation that I'm having with colleagues of mine who are concerned about this stuff and know less about the AI than, and not that I know that much about it, but than me. So we have these debates. And what I want to say to all of my friends is, there's grabbing power or giving it to someone. So how do we claim our agency in this? To me, that's the thing that really matters. And I want to sort of unpack that a little bit and then I'll give you a few things that you might do to claim agency. So first off, in thinking about how we actually make sense of this, we have a lot of experience of different kinds of people who are playing with AI and having their experiences with it. So you've got everybody from kind of execu drones and buzzword bingo superstars, people that just know how to kind of like bullshit their way through cocktail parties and sound like they know stuff, but they really don't. Then you've got people that are just, like students, have a lot of experience with this, who are doing things they couldn't do before, faster, and sometimes getting away with it, sometimes not really learning that much. We've got, everybody from the unmatched who are seeking a match to people who are properly hitched and trying to figure out how to plan their next date, to people that are slightly with it, oldsters. I put myself in that category. Kind of like, a little bit about what's going on. So it's just a wide variety of people, busy parents, people that are trying to figure out where to send their children to university. There's a lot of ways where we're using these tools. It's very broad across the demographics. And there's two stories that come out in all that, oversimplifying, hugely oversimplifying. Scary stories and stories of superheroes. And both of those are mashups of technology and people. So the scary stories are things like Frankenstein, Dracula, and the superhero ones are things like Batman or Spider-Man. And so how we think about what it looks like when we combine technologies with ourselves is where we sort of either lose the agency or claim it. And so to me, there's a few things that we can do that matter in all of this. And I want to use the words of the fictional character whose name I'm going to slightly butcher, but I'm going to try it anyway. Oscar Zoroaster, Fadric Isaac, there's an N name, like Nedry, something like that. Henkel Emmanuel Ambroise Diggs. That spells Ozpined, otherwise known as the Wizard of Oz. It was he who said to Dorothy and the Tin Man and the Lion, "Do not look behind the curtain." And I'm saying, you've got to fucking get behind that curtain. You really have to. You have to pull the full, like, Dorothy energy and to get on the yellow brick road, get yourself to Oz, get a peek behind the curtain. If you don't understand the kinds of things that Ron and Ollie were just talking about, you're bleeding out agency minute by minute. So I'm not saying you have to learn everything about AI, but it's helpful to know that it starts from data, assets that are largely stolen. And then it starts, when it got to the point where it was very powerful, the people that figured out how to build these things kind of immediately started a world to say, this is so dangerous, nobody else should be allowed to do it. Always be very suspicious of that kind of thing. Grab your wallet quickly when that happens. And so it's gotten to the point now where we are all kind of being told, this is so bad, it's so scary, just let the professionals handle it. But I'm saying, look behind the curtain. The more that you look behind the curtain, the more you'll appreciate the technology really does some amazing things, as we were just hearing. But you also figure out the ways that you can use it. So to the practical point, here are some things I think that we can do to claim agency. And I'm going to just make this autobiographical. These are things I do that I think are working for me, and I'm checking in with a lot of my friends who are doing similar things, and there's a lot of agreement around this stuff. Personally, I have like a rule: be a first drafter. Prompt engineering is such a stupid idea. It's not such a thing as like a prompt that gives you what you want. It's hard work. You write your draft, you get a critique on it. I use ChatGPT super hard, so not lying. And I use Gemini about the same amount, super hard. And I'm not embarrassed about that, but I first draft everything. So I think there's something to that. So be a first drafter, be a hard grafter. That's the using it hard. And then I think along the way, if you're not looking for things that are funny, find some laughter. If you're not doing that, it's just all going to be this darkness. And I'm not saying that there isn't darkness. I agree with Ollie about this stuff. But like once we start to sort of liberate the things that we can do and find the fun in all this, claiming agency, we have a much better chance, having peered behind the curtains, that we'll be able to use this and actually have a say in shaping how we, with AI, decide what our future looks like.
Just what you ended with. You have this policy, this way that you keep your agency strong and being assisted by these tools. I think I got first drafter. I know what that is. What's the hard drafter?
Hard grafter.
Oh, grafter.
Hard grafter, yeah. So I got it at the end of 2025. I got this thing from ChatGPT, your year in review, the sort of thing that Facebook used to do. And it was all the stuff, it's kind of happy, smiling. It was no video and no like songs, but kind of graphics of the year. So they'll get better. And it prompted me to think like, okay, if you had a market segmentation of users, what segment would I fall into? Tell me about that. And we had this conversation, and I was like, because I'll tell you, I think that I probably use you pretty hard. And it was like, oh yeah, you definitely do. Yeah, like, most people are like, that will do, that was fine, and you just keep going and keep going and keep going. Guilty. So that's what that one is.
So iteration is going to be a big part of it, not just accepting the first thing that you get back out, but then going back in. I
never like anything I write at first.
So about this agency issue, there's an interesting concept that I've been struggling with that Reid Hoffman, the co-founder of LinkedIn, introduced a year or two ago. He wrote a book called Super Agency. And one of his big points in that book was that not only are we empowered by these AI tools, he's definitely a cheerleader for the AI revolution, and to a fault, I think he only looks at the upside. He thinks there are enough people looking at the downside. I'm going to look at the upside. So he says not only is there the agency increase that I get when I follow the kinds of suggestions that, for instance, that Mark has, but there's a super agency because I'm also interacting with all these other people who are using these tools to make themselves better at what they do. So my doctor's better, my lawyer's better, my Uber driver's better, whatever. Everybody's better because of they're using AI in some way, and that makes it has a multiplicative effect.
I completely agree with the idea of centering human agency. At a collective and society level, there is that question about whether or not that does give us collectively an ability to become super agentic in terms of our collective ability to get done what we want to do. But I also wanted to link, actually, what you were saying about agency and what you said at the beginning, because the link with what I was saying is to do with who has the agency, whether it's to do with the companies or the individuals or the people. But I think a really important moment that's actually happening in the AI discussion, like online and stuff like that is the idea that these AIs themselves have agency, right? And, there's a lot of talk about agentic AI and all this kind of stuff. And in terms of looking behind the curtains, one of the things that, the more you understand how these things are actually working, you realize that, like Ron was saying, it's an illusion. The idea that these tools at the moment, in terms of the way they're constructed, the way they're built, have the same kind of thing that we would think of as agency that we have. So when I think of the agency for a person, it's because they've understood the world, they've developed their own personal goals about the world, they have some intentions to sort of work in the world towards sorting out their own goals. And so they have agency in the world to try to forward their own goals. These tools currently have none of that. And one of the reasons is because even though they have looped it round in complicated ways and looped it and made it fed back into itself and all this kind of stuff, at heart, it is still exactly what Ron was talking about. I mean, simplifying, but there's a large degree to which what is going on under the hood is a model that is just predicting the next token, the next token, the next word, the next word, the next word. And if you loop it round and do this, it does amazing coding as agentic agents and all this kind of stuff. But I think we shouldn't be confused about what that means. It's not our kind of agency. And I think we should be prioritizing and elevating our agency. And we can use our agency. We can boost it. And we should all learn how to boost our individual personal agency by using these tools. And collectively, we'll end up with potentially a sort of super agency, I guess.
I'm going to sound uncharacteristically, bearish on this rather than bullish. I'm probably more worried about people getting dumber on some things than I am just that everybody's going to be super smart. Because if you're not actually really training to do whatever it is that you're learning how to do, you're not going to be really that good at it. So that's why I think hard work still matters a lot in all this. We have a ton of students turn in assignments that meet the brief, hit everything, cite some of the literature, do all that kind of stuff. But you can tell, like from a mile away, the ones that really thought about it versus the ones that just did it quickly. So the fact that we can do stuff quickly is kind of a blessing and a curse. And the way that we've been talking about it is to me, I have this story, when I was a kid, my mother used to sew clothes sometimes for me and my siblings. And when she was a kid, her mother sewed more of the clothes that they wore than she did for us. And when her mother was, when my great grandmother was a child, they hardly bought anything that wasn't made at home. I do not weep that I don't have those skills. I don't feel bad about it. I don't miss it in my life. I feel nostalgic that, that was part of my sort of family history going back generations. I have this other stuff that I do. And so, I just go in a store and I pick out something that I think will fit me. And if it looks like it's okay and I'm not going to be embarrassed to wear it, then off we go. I maybe try to style a few things badly, but, that's it. That's the limit of it. That gives me the chance to do other things. So I besides my, be a first drafter, hard grafter, and find the laughter, I like to also say, know your lane, know what you really are into, learn your brain, figure out what you're good at, what you're not good at, how you work, how you're different from this whole thing, and then get outside and feel the rain, because I know this is sounding very hippy-trippy right now, but that I think that really works because actually we are very different from a sequence completion engine. We were talking about this over drinks earlier. We think of stuff when we're sleeping or doing other stuff. And it's the feelings that we have that actually fire us off away from sequence completion to busting out. And that's what we should be doing, And so I think it's okay that we lean into some of these skills, just not have it be on whatever is your main thing in life, because what are you here for?
So I wanted to follow up on something that Ollie raised, but I think it also relates to what Mark's talking about, which is how impressive these models can be, but it's really just the completion, it's just the next token prediction. I found it useful to view the success of these models in a slightly different way. My initial reaction, a lot of people initially, their reaction is, oh my God, look at everything that AI can do. Look at all the impressive feats that Look how good, how smart AI is, how intelligent AI is. And then my other way of looking at it is, oh, isn't it impressive how much a stupid process can achieve? So rather than saying, look how intelligent AI is, you can say, oh, I used to think that in order to do that, you had to be really intelligent, but now it turns out you can just be as stupid as these AI models are and achieve that. One has to use that with care, because you don't want to deny that when humans are doing that, they are doing it with intelligence and with judgment and care that the AI models aren't doing. But it's just incredible how much of a good driver a stupid process can be, although maybe it can't get the last mile of successful driving. So what are the pros and cons of that Gestalt switch of moving from seeing AI as being really incredibly intelligent to saying, well, actually, it's stupid, but stupid processes can achieve more than we thought they could?
To me, what I think that highlights is the way in which the times we're living through are just fascinating times for our own understanding of ourselves. One of the things that jumps out is the question, well, how are we doing it? What is that difference between what we're doing and what they're doing? I mean, like how amazingly intelligent at passing exams or coding or do these AIs have to get before we start ascribing them intelligence, and what sits in that gap? Especially because, as I say, a lot of times, a lot of human behavior is also just saying the most obvious next thing. I mean, like, just going through those motions. I think these are big open questions, and I know that there's people on the side of just saying that you can take that simple algorithm and push it all the way, and we'll get to something that we want to think of as equivalent to what a human intelligence. I don't, but there are people out there. So I think the more tasks that get ticked off as, yep, it can do that now. Yep, it can do that now. It becomes harder and harder. There's a question: is this argument being put into a smaller and smaller space in terms of what the difference really is?
One of the things that gives me heart about what people will do with this stuff is teenagers. They do not wake up in the morning and say, "How can I give you exactly what you want? How can I please you today?" They are like trying to figure out how they can sort of dork things up, and that's the polite way of saying it, to show that they are going to be in charge one day. And so I think that they will eventually take this stuff and do something with it that is not going to be just bowing down to some digital god. I don't think that's going to happen.
Well, let me throw out one idea and see how you both react to it. So there's this effect, the Dunning-Kruger effect, where the less that somebody knows about a domain, the less likely they are to be aware that they don't know much about that domain. Or inversely, the less they know about the domain, the more they'll think that they're pretty competent in the domain, right? It seems there's something like that going on with AI, where if you are not very expert in a domain, then you're really impressed by AI's results when you ask it questions. But the more you become expert in a domain or know about a domain, when you try out a generic AI model, large language model, you realize that, okay, on the surface, that's an okay response, but it actually doesn't really take into account these important factors, and therefore I'm glad that's not my doctor, or that's not my professor in philosophy, or that's not my mechanic or whatever. So what's the best way to navigate that? Because there's obviously a lot of common knowledge in these models that is there, and that sucks us in and attracts us to using it in general. But how do we navigate that? How do we avoid the hallucination landmines and the ignorance pitfalls and still get the goodness out of the models where there is goodness? Or is there no, in general, is it best to just not use them at all for that purpose, because there's no way to know where the landmines are?
This is why the know your lane thing to me is so important. If you're working on something that you're really into, you probably know a lot about it already. And you will already have had the experience that, people like me are having all the time, where you're like, why is this thing so stupid? And then you correct it and teach it. It's a fast learner, and it's good as like any doctoral student I've ever had in terms of being able to be responsive and learn quickly. But it does come up. It definitely lays some eggs. Just gives you turkey ideas, bad. But you can teach it. So I feel like, to me, it doesn't matter if I get something kind of wrong, on a topic that isn't my main thing. And like, I don't try to over-optimize on sending an email about an expense report. I don't, that's not my main deal in life. So I think if you can kind of be okay that you're not going to be an expert about everything, and then the thing that you are going to really make your thing, if you're using AI for that, don't be afraid to critique your AI. Make it a goal to sort of call it out on something and have a back and forth, not necessarily to win just because, like, if you lose, you learn. But I think that's what I would recommend.
Yeah, I was going to say three quick things on that. The first is, like, as a general advice in terms of using these tools, is always assume that it's like a recently graduated, really smart student who thinks they know everything. And if that's a subject that you know nothing about, well, they probably know more than you do. So that's useful. But they're not an authority. And if you're somebody who knows that area, then you know that they're just the grad student who's very confident and bullshitting a bit. Just assume that that's the case for everybody else, every other subject that you're engaging with. The second thing is, I think this problem in terms of the relationship between the expertise and these tools is, I think, one of the reasons why at the moment in coding there's the sense that actually the people who are actually really good coders are the ones who can often get the most out of these coding systems, because they know what they should be doing and they know when it's going wrong, and they know how to guide it in the right direction. So what's happening in terms of agency is that the people who already have high agency and competence in a certain area are the ones who are getting the most use and value out of these tools, and they're getting boosted. So there's a real risk, therefore, that we're going to get a sort of divide between people with high agency and low agency. And in the short term, for most of us here in this room, we're potentially on the other side of that sort of education process, and career process, and so we're potentially exactly the people who can get the most agentic boost from these tools. But how does that sustain itself? Because a lot of the way in which people develop their experience and develop their knowledge is through this sort of early career work and through the education that is kind of being undermined and undervalued at the moment, because at that level the AI is better than the person doing the learning. So I think there's a real problem about how does our society recreate itself when the people who are not yet the experts are potentially being replaced by AI. So there's a real question about, how do we recreate our society?
That provides a very poignant critique of that idea I mentioned before of Reid Hoffman's super agency, because he presents it as like, look, everything's going to be great because we're all going to be more agentful. We're going to be more powerful. We're going to have more agency. And if what you're saying is correct, and it rings true with me, that actually it might even make things worse, because if it's this multiplier, agency multiplier, then the haves are going to get more and the have-nots are going to be left behind. So maybe they'll have more agency with the AI, but the ones who are really benefiting and really going to clean up are those who already have a lot.
I mean, the only other thing that, to me, the obvious corollary from all of this is to be saying, well, actually, we need to be leaning into education and trying to work out how to do it in the right way, and apprenticeships and other things like that, not because there's economic value in people getting an education, not because there's economic value in employing those apprentices, but because that's the only way that we can actually train up. We've got to train the next generation to have the right experience and knowledge to become the next generation of experts who actually do know what they want to be doing with these AIs in that sort of highly agentic way.
That fires me up to say something. I had a conversation with a kid this week from China who's here for a thing that we're doing with some students that have come. And he intercepted me outside, and he was like, man, I feel like I don't have any choices. And I'm like, I get you. You kind of don't. Like as a secondary school student, we give you, like, you could do fuzzy stuff or, like techie stuff. That's how we talked about it back in the day. So, the things that are kind of quantitative or humanities oriented, and that feels like those are the two lanes that you have. But here's the deal. Whether you feel like you have or really have any choice or have none at all, what happens between the time you're 18 and the time you're, say, 28 or 38 is that people sort into thousands of different things that they do. And I have this belief that everybody is an expert at something. It might not be the thing that pays you a lot, but everybody's an expert at something. So I think that if you bring that perspective to what you do and you try to really focus on the thing that is your reason to be and major on that, then you can use these tools to be faster and better at things that you are not so good at. And maybe that makes your life a little better. I don't know if it gives us super agency, but maybe it gives us clarity about where we really have agency and can have the most that we could have. And I think if that happened, that would be good.
I think it would be good to wrap up this section by each of us saying something about where we see things going in terms of the technology, AI technology. I've been thinking a lot about what it would take for AI models to be able to reason imagistically. And so not just do this next token prediction based on the training set of linguistic data that they've had nothing to do with, that other people produced on the internet 10 years ago, but rather learning from integrating their ability to do that and use language well, together with an ability to analyze images and therefore learn how to answer questions about images and based on the actual properties of those images, and use that in their own reasoning. So when they answer a question, they don't just give the most likely linguistic token, but they give the most likely linguistic token based on some other source of information, like what things look like or spatial properties of certain things that are relevant to the conversation. So trying to move this more towards a true reasoning system rather than a thing which just answers what's most likely linguistically, given what else has been said linguistically. That's my hope or prediction for what's maybe happening now, or what will happen in the near future. But I'd like to hear what Ollie and Mark also think.
Well, I'll just briefly mention just one thing that we haven't talked about yet, and I think is more on the social side of the society reaction side to it, which is sort of elements of backlash, and I think the fact that we've got to the point now where people are banning sort of social networks for sort of kids and stuff like that suggests that we've already been a little bit inoculated to the idea that this tech could be dangerous and we maybe need to be careful of it. That's maybe helping us in the AI world. The risk is that it's an excessive backlash, because I think actually we can use AI very powerfully to become more agentic if it's used in the right way. But I do think there are going to be some subtleties and nuances here. So, for example, one of the things I've been thinking about a lot is, as somebody who's presenting content, how do you make sure that you keep a really clear relationship with the audience where you're saying, what I say they're my words, right? I'm not, if I make a YouTube video, if I'm on social media, if I make a comment online, that's me talking to you, a human to human. And I'm not going to use AI to generate the sentences that I'm communicating when I'm having those conversations. Because what's the point? I mean, like, if you want to know what ChatGPT thinks, go and ask ChatGPT. Let's have the conversation. And I think there could become something where, we could imagine in the next year or two some prominent voice gets caught out at everything they were saying was coming from ChatGPT. And it would be a bit like somebody who's been caught for plagiarism or something like that, where suddenly their reputation takes a real hit because suddenly it's like, whoa, those words were not your own. So I think that's the kind of thing that those kinds of mini backlashes, I think the kind of things I think we'll see in the next couple of years.
I got caught up in listening to these guys. I have to think. So prediction. Okay, I think that we just found a way to make, especially in the professional services context, knowledge that used to be expensive and scarce, we've found ways to make that relatively ubiquitous. I think we've also found ways to personalize things where you would give permission to somebody to know a lot about you. And I think when you take that and you combine it with what you see with the rise of influencers today, which is the number one career of choice, I'm told, by Generation Z, that suggests that we have the opportunity to figure out how we would work with AI to do things that we haven't been able to afford for people who couldn't pay for those services or that tailoring. So imagine a concierge model for delivering services that make your problems lesser in some way, make your life easier. The wealthy have already had that and always had that kind of service. If we could do that for more people, that would be great. And I think there will be a drive to do that type of thing. And I'm selling hard on that idea anyway. So
I've got one thing just to note here, which is Trump.
We made it this far without mentioning his name.
Well, sorry to ruin that. But actually, I don't know if you saw Mark Carney's speech at Davos just recently, right?
Yeah.
But Trump has just made it clear to the rest of the world that as nations, let alone individuals, but as nations, we do not want to be trusting American tech, right? The kind of venture capital dream was we pump in tons of money to this, we build up this amazing thing, we spend, and we get such a lead that nobody else can catch us. So far, that just hasn't panned out, right? The other people, what's actually happened is this simple algorithm that Ron was talking about. It's a recipe that now lots of people know how to do. What we don't have is the billions of dollars to actually build the data center, to go through the process, and da-da-da. But everybody knows the recipe. So I don't actually think that the Silicon Valley venture capital firms are going to be able to hold a grip on other countries. And I think there's going to be a lot of people who feel exactly like you do. And a lot of people who are going to say, look, we're going to build you something that you can have in your house, in your phone, and you can have more control over so that there's not that surveillance. So, yeah, it's not clear that they're going to make their money back. But, I think I think that transition will happen.
I'd like to run with that last idea a little bit further. I don't know if this is going to actually ever be the case, but the way things are going, it could very well be that we'll be able to run large language models of very sophisticated complexity on our machines locally, and you won't have to rely on OpenAI or on Anthropic or on DeepSeek or whatever. But there are public domain models which are being released that where they've already spent all the money on training them, and maybe that was done in a more ethical way, and maybe it's done in a more open or publicly observable way, which would mean you could just download those weights onto your own machine and run your own large language model locally. We're just now getting to the points that to the point where the kinds of machines that people can typically afford can run the models that are large enough to produce good results in response times that are acceptable, that are on the order of seconds or less. So we're just getting to that point. So maybe there will always be a desire for the best models that only the big companies or sovereign states can produce. But if you're happy with just something that kind of works and performs like the models we have now do, then maybe you won't need to. Maybe you'll be able to roll your own, or not. Use one that has already been rolled and install it on your own machine and not rely on any big corporation. That's a possibility.